Hello, everybody, and welcome to Houston Tech Fest 2020, the virtual edition. Before we get started, I wanted to point your attention to, like in every other session, the Q&A feature. It's under the two little chat bubbles with the question mark in the upper right hand of your interface. You should see an announcement there that has the Houston Tech Fest website and all that in it right now. Please go ahead and type any questions you may have throughout the session. Our presenter, Jay, will be monitoring those, as well as I'll be publishing them, and so you'll see questions show up there, and then we'll filter those into the conversation throughout, as well as wrap up with a Q&A. So without further ado, because this is the last session, I typically would have pointed you to the next ones. We are proud to present Jay Sawyer from Catapult, who will be going through and sharing ARM templates in Azure. Arm yourself in Azure, deploying cloud resources. So Jay, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Devlin. Good to see you here today. So, welcome everybody. We are going to dig in just a little bit, kind of scratch the surface of these things called ARM templates. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about and define what ARM templates are and what we mean by them. And then also how you can create them. From there, we'll get into how you can edit and customize your ARM templates, and in particular, the tools that you want to use to do that. You can always use Notepad. That's always an option if you like Paint. But we're going to do, a bit better tools. And then we're going to look at ARM templates and how ARM templates fit into a continuous deployment strategy, right? So they're not going to be necessarily part of the CI, right? But they will definitely be a part of the CD aspect of CI/CD. And our goal here really is to provide a very high level and brief introduction to using ARM templates to deploy your Azure resources. So what are these ARM template things? ARM actually stands for Azure Resource Manager. And so they are templates defined in JSON that allow you to define what your Azure resources are going to be. It's a very declarative syntax that allows you to define pretty much your entire Azure infrastructure. There's a couple of things, like if you're getting into API management gateway, where it's a little bit kind of icky. But for the most part, 99.9% of your Azure infrastructure can be defined completely within ARM templates and deployed completely within ARM templates. So it gives you very highly repeatable results. Every time you deploy, it deploys the same way. This is a heck of a lot better than going into Azure Portal and saying, okay, so you have to click this and click that and click this and click that. Because when that is your deployment strategy, invariably, you're going to fat finger something. You're going to miss a step. You're going to mistype something, right? That happens. Plus, God, it's boring. You can also, it also allows for orchestration, and it's actually kind of built in, right? Resources can be deployed in parallel. It will take a look at a very large ARM template, and where possible, it will deploy multiple resources simultaneously. This is not something that you can very easily do from the Azure portal. That said, it doesn't always work that way. There are times when resource A requires resource B to be created first. A perfect example of this is an Azure function, right? An Azure function requires storage to be created first. So you can define those dependencies when you need to in your ARM template. And they're also modular. They are repeatable, standardized, reusable pieces. And in fact, at the client where we currently are, we have an entire library of ARM templates. When we want to deploy an Azure function, this is the ARM template that we use. So every Azure function within the environment looks identical. It has, we don't have to worry, did somebody turn on always on and run up the bill, right? Because that's all defined in the ARM template. And it helps ensure that consistency, particularly in large environments. It also helps ensure consistency as you're deploying from, say, dev to test to QA to production, etc. So, all kinds of goodness in there. Now, you can very quickly go in and create ARM templates. It is super easy. In fact, Azure will do this for you. You go into Azure Portal and you will see in the Azure Portal screen, you'll see this option to export the template. Or if you go into a particular service, right? So we have a function app here. You'll see this option to export the template. Also, if you go into Visual Studio and you create a function app and you want to do the publish from Visual Studio, which you really shouldn't be doing, right? You should not be publishing from Visual Studio. Please don't do that like in a real world environment. Demos well, not for the real world. But if you do that, Visual Studio will very happily export an ARM template for you when you go ahead and publish whatever it is that you're publishing, whether it's a function app, web app, whatever it is that you're publishing from Visual Studio. It will create an ARM template for you. Now, this is where a lot of folks start with ARM templates, and this is also where a lot of them stop. They don't go really much further than this. And the reason is, well, one, it's kind of easy. Two, particularly if you're just getting started, you look at these things that just got exported and just got created, and you're like, oh my God, that's really terrifying. I have no idea what this is doing. So that's number two. Number three, surprise, surprise, they don't always work. In fact, a lot of times they will include every property, whether it needs to be there or not. And sometimes it will include a default that, depending on what you do, depending on how you deploy it the next time, it may not work. That's pretty unusual, but I've seen it happen more than once. So folks will, very quickly kind of, either A, use them kind of as is if they work for them to move to a new environment, or B, just, not bother to go any further because it breaks and this sucks and I don't want to do it. So I'm just going to throw it and just go back to the way that I know, which is creating everything by hand, which is boring. So these templates too, right? They're not always necessarily going to include everything that you need, right? So the Visual Studio templates will only include resources directly created in the publish. So they won't necessarily create things like VNets or subnets or anything like that you may depend on. Azure item templates, right? So if you go into an Azure function, that item template, it's only going to include a single resource. So if you go into an Azure function and you export that Azure function, it's not going to include the Azure storage that you need for that function. Now, resource group templates will include all selected resources, and they'll do a pretty reasonable job of figuring out what your dependencies are too. And they actually usually work relatively well, although sometimes they go boom. But they will also, maybe if you're using resources that are like in another resource group, they won't necessarily include those. And they're going to be a lot bigger than you need, and you may not need to deploy all of those resources in the resource group. So you have a couple of tools for working with Visual Studio. Working with Visual Studio. Duh. You have tools for working with ARM templates. Visual Studio will say that it does ARM templates. Just say no. The Visual Studio support for ARM templates I've found is not ideal, and I've had all kinds of nightmares with it, and I've just sworn off of Visual Studio for ARM templates. VS Code, however, works quite well for ARM templates, and there are some tools that you can add in. Now, the number one tool that you need is Azure Resource Manager, or ARM tools. And it will contain templates, snippets, it has schema integration, it will have completions in there for you, and parameter file generation. Now, there are some other tools that if you want to, you can go ahead and install. There's a bunch of ARM tools that you can install into VS Code. For what we're looking at today, though, we're just going to be using the basic one, this Azure Resource Manager tools. And you'll see kind of what it does, and it becomes actually a really good environment to craft your ARM templates. So let's go ahead. I've talked about these exported templates. You've probably got the idea that I'm not a big fan of them, which I'm not, but let's go ahead and take a look at them. So let's flip over to VS Code. So here we are in VS Code. Let me, oh, it's Control Plus. There we go. Let me zoom in just a bit. All right, so here we have VS Code, and let's take a look first at the resource group templates. So this is a template. Never ask again. This is a template that was exported when I just exported all of the resources in a particular resource group. And you'll notice VS Code in here is saying, hey, would you like to use the latest schema for deployment? So this right here, this API version, actually defines what the schema is, and it will define what properties are actually available to you when you're using the ARM template. So VS Code will try to be helpful and make sure that you're always up on the latest version of the JSON schema for Azure, because we know Azure is changing constantly. So those are pretty frequently updated, and each component will have its own schema. So here it is. And you'll notice it's got parameters. So we're defining some parameters in here for, what we want the plan to be called, what we want the queue to be called, and you can replace these, right? And if you say wanted to stand up a new environment, you would do that here. But you'll also see, let's take a look at some of the other things that it exported in here. And in fact, I'm going to come down to the end, because there's some stuff in here that we really don't need, like this hostname bindings. Right? I don't need this. This is the default right here, the default hostname bindings, but it went ahead and exported that for me anyway. The same here, right? This is all default stuff. Now, what we see here is this is actually exporting the record of a deployment, which you really actually don't want in your ARM template. And we'll see what these are later. But that record of a previous deployment, it's there. It's a part of the resource group, and it very happily actually exports it. So that's not necessarily good. And you'll see this is just a whole lot of stuff in here. We'll also see that, when I look at this, right, so this hostname SSL states, if I change the name of the function, this is also going to need to change. So even though it exported, and it did okay, it doesn't really necessarily pick up on some of those subtle dependencies, right? So these hostname SSL states, it's got to be the same as the name of the function. And if I'm deploying it into a new environment and I want to have a slightly different name for that new environment, say UAT, then I have to go through and I have to find all these things. And that's why a lot of times it doesn't work. The VS template, right? Again, it goes ahead and exports it for you. The VS template is probably a little bit better. So you'll see that I'm creating a function here, and this is my function app. And you'll see that it has some dependencies on the storage account. And so this is a bit cleaner, right? There's less going on, but you don't see things like, if you want to do App Insights and automatically hook it up into App Insights, that's not exported, and a couple other things aren't there. But hey, it's certainly a whole lot less intimidating than exporting the entire resource group. And the good thing is, it doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff that we don't need. So that gives you an idea. Oh, here's the function export, right? So let's take a look at the template. So this is actually exporting from an individual function. Its initial name was demo func read service bus queue. And so it's exporting this service. Now this function requires a queue because it's reading a service bus queue. And we saw that that's actually in the resource group template, but it's not in any of the others. Right? So, because Visual Studio isn't going to necessarily export the queue. And then if I'm just doing the function, it's just exporting the function and all the properties of the function, but it doesn't export storage. Right? So there's some limitations. That said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And these are actually really useful too if you are hand tweaking your own ARM templates. You set something up in Azure kind of the way you want it, because sometimes it's a lot easier to do that in the portal. And then you do the export and you see what changed. You see kind of how it sets the properties in when it exports the resource, and you see kind of where those are. So I'm not going to say that these are without use. They are absolutely useful and they are absolutely good to use, but this is not, I would not take and deploy an entire Azure infrastructure from these generated ARM templates. In fact, I primarily use them kind of, as I mentioned, to go in there and say, I want to set up X, Y, and Z. I know how to do it by hand in the portal. That's cool. So I'm going to go do it in the portal. I'm going to export it, and I'm going to see what it generated in the template. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to tweak and hand roll and hand modify my template, right? Actually, I usually typically create them from scratch, which is what we will talk about in just a few minutes. But I wanted to go ahead and point that out to you. And let's real quick, let's go and see where some of these are, right? So here's an Azure environment. This is a demo environment. So we're going to go in and I will take a look at, let me go into this resource group right here. Right, so this ARM templates resource group. And you'll see that I have app insights, a function app, an app service plan, queue and function, right? And I can come in and if I select, say my queue, I can go ahead and export the template, right? So we see it right there. And you'll see this really on just about, I think, in fact, I can't even think of any Azure resources where you don't see the option to export the template. You go ahead and click that, and it will generate the template. It will include parameters for you. Oh, 2 resource types cannot be exported yet and are not included in the template. See error details. Virtual network rules. Well, I'm not using any VNets here, and IP filter rules. Well, I'm not using those here. So, fortunately, right? But this actually also gives you one of the limitations, is that not everything is exportable, but here's the thing. If it's available in Azure, you can define it in an ARM template. You just have to go figure out how. We'll talk about how you do that. So this is another one of the issues with exporting, is that it doesn't always export every resource. Right now, if I come back to my resource group, I can just come here and select. Let's say I want to select this and this and this, and then export template, and it will export the template for those selected resources. Okay, so let's go in and talk about editing and customizing the ARM templates. Now I just showed you the wizards and the stuff that's generated. It's a good start, and it's really helpful, to kind of see how some of the stuff is done and see how some of it works. But it does need some work. Once you start getting into customizing ARM templates, you'll see that customizing those allow you to have more input variables. And they also allow you to do things like abstract your naming conventions. This is something that, if you're just doing 1 or 2 apps in Azure, maybe not that big a deal, right? But when you have an environment like my current client where we have several hundred resources in Azure, naming conventions, start to become really important. All right, because you don't want everybody going in there and just naming things willy-nilly however they want, right? And so customizing the ARM templates will allow you to abstract some of those naming conventions. It also allows you to do things like minor variations for different environments. So for example, in the dev environment, right, you may want to have your function app set so that it will shut down if it's not being used for 5 minutes. Why? We'll save on cost. But you may not want to have that in the production environment. You may want to set your function app to be always on. Or you may want to have a different app plan in the production environment, right? So those types of minor variations are things that you can go ahead and tweak and customize and have passed in as parameters to your ARM template and really kind of start kind of enhancing them and kind of kicking them up based on what your actual deployment environment is going to be like. It also allows you to separate logical components and reuse them in bits and pieces and parts. So, for example, what we're going to look at is, I'm going to have one template for it. It's an Azure function with a queue, and it creates the storage, it creates the Azure function, it creates the queue, and we're all going to do it in one ARM template, right? But in your environment, you may want to go ahead and say, you know what, I want to have one standard ARM template that creates a service bus and creates the queue. I want to have another standard ARM template that creates the function. And so when it comes time to deploy, you say, you know what, I want this ARM template, I want this ARM template, I want this ARM template, and that is going to deploy my complete solution from all the different pieces and parts and bits and pieces. You can also go in and have ARM templates combined. So pull them in and pull multiple ARM templates into a single ARM template. We're not going to get into that here, really, for the sake of time. But that's another option that customizing ARM templates allows you to do. Now, I talked about exporting, right? And exporting is certainly one thing, but there are also a bunch of Quickstart templates that have been developed and posted out there, and they contain templates for a wide variety of tasks. And this kind of shows you what the Quickstart templates looks like, right? So here you see I typed in function, and it came back with 37 templates that match my filter. Now, I'm not sure why Azure Active Directory forest with optional subdomain actually comes back from function, but okay. But you'll see that an Azure Relay namespace, I'm not sure about that, but Logic App with function, Azure Function Premium with VNet integration, create a function app and call it using a custom resource, create a function app with a managed service identity. So a bunch of these little tasks are going to be out there in the Quickstart templates, and they have a standardized format. They have documentation with them. They have parameterization with them, and they're another really good resource, apart from the export, because they're mainly done, by folks who are really super familiar with ARM templates, and they will have just what you actually need to deploy a specific scenario. So you can take and you can download these and maybe tweak them a little bit, maybe use them as is. And they're typically, a lot simpler and cleaner than what Azure exports for you. You can, when you're browsing through the Quickstart templates, there's actually an option, if you want, to deploy it directly into Azure. And so you can deploy these Quickstart templates right into Azure and get set up. So it's another good way to get started. Right down here is the URL, or you can just Google Azure Quickstart templates, and it will take you there. Editing and customizing them, right? Some of the things that we're going to be doing. Number one, parameters, right? Define the inputs for the template, because every time you run the template, well, you may want it to be the same every time, in which case you really don't need parameters. But for the most part, right, you will want at least, dev, maybe test, and maybe production, right? And you may want to deploy the same ARM template to dev and the same to test, and maybe a slightly different one to production, right? So you define parameters that are inputs for the template. And then that allows you to very quickly just modify certain small things that you need to change per environment or per deployment instance. Now, optionally, and you're going to see these, you can also include a default value, and it's optional. I don't think it should be, but it's optional to include a description. So the description, that's your .comments, right? So you definitely, I don't view the description personally as optional. I always include a description because if nothing else, it helps me remember what the heck I was thinking of when I named that parameter. Because I can't remember like the next day what I was doing the day before. You know, get a week in between and I'm really bad. A month, oh, it's gone. I did what? I don't even remember it. You can also define variables. So variables allow for reusable or, you know, and this is how I use them a lot, pre-computed values. So if you find yourself, say, taking certain parameters and concatenating them together to build names, you're doing that over and over again. Well, just put that in a variable and reuse it in multiple places. They have, and again, this is going to be something that you see, but they allow you to really simplify some of the creation, particularly when it comes to things like naming conventions and that kind of stuff. You also have a bunch of ARM functions that are pre-built functions that are useful when creating ARM templates. Now, it's not a lot of them. It's not like, you know, full .NET framework or anything like that, or PowerShell, right? But a lot of these functions are really darn useful and really geared towards that Azure environment. So things like resource IDs, and that kind of stuff are going to be available there. So let's go ahead, and before we get into some of the editing templates, right? Let me go ahead and show you a little bit, right? So here's the documentation on the ARM template functions, right? So you'll see that we have functions for working with arrays, we have functions, we have comparison functions, date functions, deployment value functions, logical functions, numerics, right? And this is about it. These are pretty darn handy. You'll see where I use list keys. You can use things like list secrets, right? String functions, again, these are things that I use quite a bit. So there's not a whole lot of them, right? But this, you know, most of the time, this will cover kind of the stuff that you wind up needing to do. You can also create some user-defined functions. We're not gonna get into that here, but those let you build kind of reusable chunks of functions that you can also call. Also up here, I want to kind of point this out, is the template reference. So this is the documentation for ARM templates and all of the different objects that you can create. So if you want to create, say, it'll be, let's see, Microsoft.web. There we go. You'll typically want to go into the latest, right? And so this would be Microsoft.web/sites. And so this actually shows you, right here is the documentation of all the properties that are available to create. This is going to be either an app service or a function. And then it also gives documentation that is, okay. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes not so much, right? But it will at least give you an idea. Now this, combined with what you see on the Quickstart templates, can really be useful to get you up and running, right? So here's our Quickstart templates. I talked about these. Go in here and I type function. And see, here's the 37 templates that match my filter. There is still Active Directory Forest, which I don't get, right? There we go. I want to create something with a managed service identity. I can come in here. Notice I can deploy straight to GitHub. It gives you examples on how to do it through PowerShell. You can also browse it on GitHub, right? And so this shows you, if you come in here, Azure deploy.json is always going to be the ARM template. So this shows you a bunch of the the different values, and how to create them. Much simpler than what you wind up exporting, and also typically a lot more useful. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of our ARM templates. So we're going to be working with this right here. So this is really taking a look at a Azure function and a service bus queue, and it's deploying them together. It's deploying them together into a individual resource group, right? And so you'll see that I have defined a set of parameters here, right? So I have environment. So what the default value is going to be demo, but is this dev? Is it test? Is it production? Is it whatever, right? So this allows me to actually build a whole new environment really, actually very quickly. I just redeploy the ARM template and poof, everything is there. In this case, right, we've decided that we're going to use naming conventions, right? So what the application name is one part of the convention, and then an application group, right? So a solution, for example, may include more than one application. So this allows me to kind of group them all together. They have some similar names, but it's also used in that naming convention. And then what my queue name is going to be. Now I could, actually just build the queue name from the other variables if I wanted to, but in this case, I'm saying, go ahead and pass that in. Now you'll see here, this is where I'm doing things like building all of my resources based on naming conventions, right? So we've decided as an organization, for example, that our naming convention is going to vary just a little bit from the Microsoft guidance, in that we are going to prefix everything with what environment it is. Is it dev environment? Is it prod? Whatever. So that's going to be the first part of our name. And then we're going to have another part of the name that indicates what type of resource it is, right? Is it a function? Is it a plan? Is it app insights? Is it storage, right? And so I'm defining that here. And then these other things, application group and application name. So all of those things are being used to build up my standard names and keep everything kind of very consistent in my environment. And so I'm going ahead and I'm building these up right here. I'm going to use them later, and some of these I will use multiple times later. But this way, everything is right here. It's very easy for me to get. We're also defining some outputs, and we're going to see this later and why we would want to do outputs. So this is stuff that comes out of the ARM template and gets and gets supplied back to the script that called it. Now, this is super useful in your deployment pipelines. We will see that, and I'll show you how to work with these things. Because, for example, in this case, I'm not passing in the function name. And in fact, if we decide to change our naming convention, do we want to have to go and change a whole bunch of dependent pipelines? Or do we want the pipelines to simply go ahead and use whatever function, however it got named, right? Because it's the responsibility of the ARM template to determine what the name is. So these will be output, and you'll see where those get used. So we come in here. These are the details of my template. Oh, you'll also see, right? So right here, this is the syntax when we're actually calling into the functions, right? So you come in and you do open square bracket, and then you start typing your function, right? So if I want to come in and I want to put a new variable in here, and I'm going to call this goober, right? Do it in quotes. Once I put in these brackets, you'll notice here's my IntelliSense, right? I can say format, right? And this gives me a format string. Right, so that's another way I could do that instead of concat. Right, and you'll notice that the IntelliSense was there. Here's all my resources as I define them. You can also, on some of these functions, they actually return an object. and you can call properties on them. So in this case, right, I'm saying, you know what, the location for all of these is going to be the location of the containing resource group. So that's what I'm saying right here. I'm saying whatever location, wherever that resource group is, this goes in the same location. And so some of the other things that you see in here, though, are going to be, well, let's see, did I put it up in the, yeah, no, I didn't. But some of the other things that you see is dependencies right here, right? So here, right, this is the configuration, and it depends on the function. So in order to create the config section, because this is the config section here, that function has to be created first. And so that is allowing me to say and determine the order in which stuff gets created. Also, notice how VS Code allows me to collapse things. Right here, my queue requires that the service bus be created. File services. So I don't have anything in here really in any particular order. Here is my actual function app. And this, right, one of the things that you need to do with Azure Functions, right, is number one, make sure that storage is created first, right? So this is using that resource ID function to get the resource ID of this storage account name, right? But I can also come in here and say, and set all of the different parameters that are required, all the different properties, so that the Azure function can point to the storage that it depends on. So web job storage, web job dashboard, etc., the share name, right? All of this stuff is going ahead and it's calling list keys to actually get the keys out of there so I can build that entire connection string. The other thing I'm doing here, right? So this is a custom one, right? This is so that my function app can actually hook up into the service bus queue, right? So the demo queue connection string is what I use to connect to that service bus queue and listen on it. And I'm going ahead and actually defining that here. Now this works because the queue is in the same ARM template. And so I can get its primary connection string. And in this case, I think I'm pulling out the entity path and clearing that out. So this is building up that connection string so that I can get to my queue. So all of this stuff is just kind of baked in there. And this represents my entire environment. I can come in here, and one of the tools that we have, part of the VS Code tools, is it will allow me to see all of the different resources and browse through them right here. So if I want to go straight to, say, my storage account, right? It's a storage account. That's file services, right? So that's telling me the type is file services. So where's my storage account? That's my share. Oh, there it is. Storage account name, right? And so you can jump very quickly back and forth between all of the different resources that you have defined in your ARM template. So that's a little bit on editing them. Hopefully you'll see VS Code is actually a really good environment for it. Super lightweight. It can be integrated with Azure DevOps source control as well. You definitely want to keep your ARM templates in source control. Don't just keep them on your hard drive. Now, once you've done your ARM template, how do you deploy it? So there's a couple of ways. The first way we're going to do is we're going to take a look at actually executing and deploying your ARM templates using PowerShell directly from VS Code. Now, when I'm working with ARM templates, I do this actually quite a bit because I'm going to be testing that ARM template to make sure that it creates the resources the way I want them created, to make sure that it works and it doesn't error out. It's a lot quicker for me to do this in PowerShell from VS Code than to have to keep doing it through, say, through a deployment pipeline. You do need to install PowerShell 6 or higher, and you also need to install the AZ module. The Azure RM module is still there, but it's deprecated. It works for most resources, but not all. The recommendation now is to use the new AZ module. The good thing about the AZ module is it's less typing is also required for the AZ module than the Azure RM module. Also, some of the newer resources aren't supported in Azure RM where they are supported in AZ. And what you'll need to do that is, number one, connect AZ account. So connect AZ account connects to your Azure account. You really only need to do it once. You can supply your subscription name. So if the account that you use to connect to Azure has access to multiple subscriptions, you're going to want to use the subscription name argument to pick which subscription you're working with. If you only have one subscription that your account is can write to, then hey, you're good. You don't need to. The next one is new AZ resource group. So typically you're going to want to deploy your ARM templates into a resource group. If you need to create the resource group, you need to do that. The ARM template is not going to create that resource group for you. So you may need new AZ resource group, include the name, include the location, and it will go ahead and create that resource group. From there, you call new AZ resource group deployment. Now, I don't have any of the arguments here. There's a whole list or slew of arguments, but typically you will include the resource group argument, you will include the template file, and then parameters. You can also view the deployment results. So once you do a deployment, Azure tracks those deployments, and you can see if they succeeded, yay, or if they failed, boo. But when they fail, typically coming in here gives you a better idea of what you messed up than the error message that it returns. And you will also see all of the different resources that got deployed as a part of that deployment. So let's go ahead and take a look at working with PowerShell and viewing our deployments. So I'm going to do that right here from VS Code. Now I've already gone in and connected to my personal Azure subscription. Now notice it says to sign in, use a web browser and open the page, blah, right? Control click and use this code to authenticate. So that's how it actually authenticates you. You are going to have to open up your browser. I've changed to the directive that contains my templates simply because it's easier. Not sure what edits I made to this, but I'm just going to undo all of them because that makes me nervous. Now, let me also show you the parameters files. Now, you can pass in the parameters individually. I like using files because it just makes it that much more repeatable and that much less that I have to type, right? So you'll see that I have my template. You'll see, oh, also, here's my description. I remember I was mentioning that, the description for all the parameters. And then right here, I have, on my parameter files, right? So here we go. I have defined this environment is going to be goo. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create and you'll see that you have your IntelliSense and autocomplete in here for PowerShell. You also have autocomplete for arguments. Name is going to be and right. So this is going to go ahead and it's going to create my new resource group for me. Oh, it's saying it lost my subscription. I connected my AZ account. So it's going to make me do that. So let me get that real quick. You'll get to see that. There we go. So that's what it does when you connect. I'm going to go ahead and create my new AZ resource group. Okay, maybe not. That's kind of odd. No. That's kind of odd. I've never actually seen it do that. Maybe I have that goo in there. It's still arguing. So that's actually kind of weird. I can't say that I know what to make of that. So normally that works, and it goes ahead and deploys, and we would do a new. No. There we go. New AZ resource group deployment, and I'm going to say my template file. Yeah. But it should be selected already. My template file is going to be function arm and queue.json. And my template parameter file is going to be, and it doesn't, it wants the resource group name. I don't know off the top of my head what resource group I have. Well, this should be fun. I'll go ahead and throw it out there. Now, notice too, if you forget arguments, it will actually put them in there for you. And this is probably going to, oh no, it's actually asking me for all of the parameters that I forgot to put into my template parameter file because I just got messed up. And queue name is yeah. So yeah, I probably need to select the subscription. It should have selected it when I logged in. Yeah, there's something kind of wonky going on. So this is really weird because the account that I logged, my Sawyer at Live, only has access to one subscription. So yeah, this is kind of weird. But that's okay because we are going to work through this because that's just for kind of doing it while you're working on them. When I'm actually using them, I use them in continuous deployment. And I set up the pipelines in Azure DevOps that comes after the build, and it goes ahead and it deploys the resources via ARM template. And so you integrate this with the build services, and not only does it deploy it, but it actually can stand up and create your entire Azure environment, like just right with a couple of clicks, just boom, boom, boom. And away it goes. Now, your templates, when you run them through Azure DevOps build services, the templates can have a parameters file, or it can have individuals passed in, or it can do both. And that both is actually pretty useful because what you may have is a standard parameters file, and we have this here. And then you can override individual parameters as you need, right? So in my case, for example, because of the way we're using environment is passed in, and then, but everything else is going to be the same. every time I deploy it. So that I will override when I actually run the template, but everything else will come from that parameters file. Now, the templates themselves, if you're going to run them, they need to either come from a repo, which is what I typically recommend, or they need to be included in the build artifacts. So if they're included in the build artifacts, you got to make sure as part of your build cycle, you go ahead and you copy them over and you know where they are and yada, yada, yada. I like to have my ARM templates in a separate repo by themselves, as separate from the actual source code. And then I just include that repository in the deployment pipeline and I give it a name. And so it is independent from the build itself. And what this allows you to do is you can actually redeploy to multiple environments, right? Or redeploy the same build over and over again, just tweaking the ARM templates. You have a deployment task for it. It is the ARM template deployment task. And you just fill that in and away you go. So from there, right, you notice the input parameters that I had. You can use those, the output parameters that I had. You can use those output parameters and feed them into additional tasks. And so this is actually pretty useful for us, right? In our case, that function app and the name of the function app, well, I need that to actually deploy my function app to the function that I just created. So I don't know what the name is, right? That name is created inside the ARM template itself. So I use that as an output parameter. Now, it just requires a little bit of trickery in that you need to have a variable to hold the output parameters. Well, you don't really need to. It'll create the parameter for you. I like to name them so that way I know what it's called, because otherwise I'll forget. And then a PowerShell script, and you can include this as a file or you can include it as an inline script that writes the output parameter files into pipeline variables. And once you do that, you can take those output parameters and they can then be fed into additional downstream tasks. So let's go ahead and take a look at using this in pipelines. Hopefully this is not going to argue with me. Here is my ARM release pipeline. So you'll see here, right? I've got the ARM templates demo. So this is the build, right? I have a YAML pipeline just for the build, and it has the deploy stage here, but I have the deploy stage is actually separate in here as a release pipeline. And you'll notice this release is out to dev, it's out to UAT. Well, that's nifty. How do we do that? Right, release number 8. This will tell me kind of which build it came from, 2020-09-07-0.1. So 5 days ago. If I do a new build, that will update. Let's go ahead and edit this release pipeline and see what it looks like. Right. So we look in here. Here we are. We're deploying the resources. So that it's deploying into a resource group. Right, ARM templates demo. This is the template that we've been looking at. Here's the parameters file, and then I'm just overriding one parameter. So how did I define this in my pipeline? Right here. So here's my build. All right, this is coming from that ARM templates demo build pipeline. But then separately, I'm pulling in my ARM templates from a repo, and a repo that is dedicated to ARM templates only, coming from the master branch, and then I'm giving it a source alias of ARM. So when I come in here to deploy these resources, right, that's this right here. Now, because it's in there, right, we can go ahead and browse and it will show it to me. Right, we can see everything and it will browse it correctly. So you don't necessarily have to remember $system.default working directory / blah, 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 blah. All right, so that's another thing that doing that helps with is you know what it's going to look like. Now the variables I'm defining in here. So here's my pipeline variable. So you'll see that I have environment in here, and the environment is scoped to each particular task. So I have one task for each environment, one for UAT. And if I want to go ahead and create production, right, I can come in here. I can clone the existing one. I'm going to call this one prod. I'm going to come into my variables and I'm going to call it prod. And there we go. I can now deploy to production, and it is going to look identical to dev. It's going to look identical to UAT. I might want to come in here and, you know, if I had, say, a parameter to make the function app always on, I might want to override that in here, say always on true. The next step is once I deploy the ARM resources, I'm actually using this PowerShell script to read the ARM outputs. So a little bit of trickery in here in that the deployment outputs right here has to go into a variable. So you'll see it goes into this ARM output variable that I have to find. And then I have a PowerShell script that takes that ARM output variable and it creates the pipeline variables for it. So that script looks like this right here. And I actually have an optional prefix. But what I do is I take that ARM output string. This is actually done as JSON. So I read through the JSON, and for each value in there, it becomes a pipeline template. I mean, a pipeline variable. So that's what this is doing right here. It's doing a for each over all the properties on that object, taking out the type, whether it's a string or a secure string. If it's a secure string, I write to the host that it's star. Otherwise, I go ahead and write the value out. So this is useful for debugging, so you can see what's going on. If I include a property prefix, I put that in there. In this case, I'm not. And that will take those output variables, those output parameters that I defined right here, and I will have function app name, storage account name, and service bus name as variables in my pipeline. So you'll see I use that right here in the very next task, which is deployed to function app. Which function?
There was a quick question on whether you could zoom in a little on the PowerShell script for the pipeline variables, or maybe send a GitHub link out, because there were some questions about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I missed that. Thank you.
It just came in, so it was the script you were just in.
Right. So this guy right here, and you'll see I have input parameters right here. This convert from JSON, so it actually comes in as a JSON object, and it converts it from JSON into a PowerShell object, and then loop over the properties. And then this right here, this write host, this one right here is what actually creates the property. Those two lines. And it just, the difference is one is secret, the other one is not. And that is that's the only difference. So it's really a super simple script. And yes, I can go ahead and send a link to this repo so that you can like download and steal it. I stole it from someone else, so you know it's all good. But super simple script, super useful, because then it allows me to do this. Right? What's my app name that I'm deploying to? I don't know. I can't remember my naming convention. But fortunately, my ARM template tells me what function app it just created that I need to go ahead and deploy to. So once that's done, let's come back to my pipeline. Now you'll notice we can have pre-approval. We can have approvals. We can have gates. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do in here. I just have approvals so that you can see it. But you can just let it fly and let it go through all the environments if you want. You want to run it, you go ahead and here, let's save it. Yep. And then create release. Go ahead and create the release. and away it's going to go. Now, what's interesting too about this is the permissions that the pipeline is running under are actually very specific to the pipeline, and they have to be set up with permissions to that subscription. But what that also means is, me as an individual, I don't necessarily have to have permission to the Azure environment that I'm deploying to. So just the pipeline does. And so this becomes really useful in environments where you don't want to have the developers have access to production. Now, I know that's craziness, right? I mean, they should just let us do whatever we want in production. But, you know, some folks think that that's like a big deal and we shouldn't be messing about in production. So this allows for us to go ahead and actually deploy into production. Or, you know, let's say you have a manager that wants to make sure that they click a button so that they approve a deployment, and they always approve it when you tell them to approve it. So, but it makes them feel important, right? So you can actually do that in here too. This is going to go out and it's going ahead and deploying the resources, right? You can watch the logs. This is really boring. I spend a lot of time doing this, much more time than I would like. So while this is going on, and until it needs the approval, let's go ahead and actually take a look at what some of these deployments look like. Right, so you'll see that I had a deployment out here that succeeded. It took 1 minute and 37 seconds. And as I drill in, right, I can drill into the details and see all of the different items that got created. And if I go up here to, I think this one might have some, no, these all succeeded too. Darn, I think I deleted the resource group with all the failures, which is unfortunate, right? So you can see that I have 10 deployments out here. You can see that they succeeded, and it'll show you, you know, everything that was in there. If there were errors, something went wrong, this is typically where you want to look, because this will typically have more details. In the operation details, you'll have, if there is an error, you'll typically have something a bit more useful here, though it's not always fully useful, but a bit more useful here than you will see in the output of the pipeline. So there it goes. It went ahead and we succeeded. Let me come back to my release. I'll go ahead and approve. Right. So it's going out and it's doing UAT, right? And notice it sent me an email saying, hey, you need to approve that, right? And so away it goes. So while this is going on, this is a perfect time. Now it does take a minute. So if you have questions, it might take a minute or two for me to see it. But if you have any additional questions about ARM templates or how some of this stuff works, now would be a good time to go ahead and put it in there. The prod environment, by the way, doesn't currently exist. So when we go to my dashboard, right, you'll see that, let me do, right, you'll see I have dev, I have UAT, but prod's not there. What you'll actually see happen is once it gets to that, it will go ahead and, unlike when running PowerShell manually, when you're deploying through a pipeline, it will actually go ahead and create that, the resource group for you. So that's darn handy. Come on, deploy it, deploy it. Once the resources are already there, by the way, it's pretty quick. That prod deployment will take a bit longer because the resources aren't there. It's actually creating them. If you made changes, to your resource, so you went in and you hand typed in the resource or changed your Azure resource, the ARM template will override those changes and overwrite them. So it helps make sure that you keep them keep your resources the way they should be. Thoughts on if an ARM template has new infrastructure changes for, say, version 2? Typically, you're going to want to do the infrastructure changes before you do the app changes. That's going to be something that you need to coordinate with the infrastructure folks. You want to try not to do those types of breaking changes. Yeah, it's okay. So now that's also something that you can, now when you say infrastructure changes, do you mean things like changes to your VNets and subnets, or do you mean changes to the resources themselves? So the question was thoughts on if an ARM template has new infrastructure changes for, say, version 2.0 of a web release. If I release the infrastructure change, which I'm assuming means VNets, subnets, that kind of stuff, or the web app before the other, then the app might break momentarily. And it might. When you do them as ARM templates, by the way, so what we typically do, come on, approve, is we'll actually have tasks for any infrastructure stuff that rolls out, and then we roll out the actual app. Depending on your environment, right, you might app setting override configs usually. Okay, now when you say infrastructure, I was thinking VNets and subnets and that kind of stuff, which is kind of a different ballgame. No, app settings and that kind of stuff, what I would do is I would actually deploy those out to a deployment slot. So when you do your deploy, you can deploy to a deployment slot, and then you can actually have a step in your deployment pipeline that actually swaps the slots. So you wind up with very, very little, if any, downtime, because version 2 gets deployed to kind of a staging slot. Everything gets set up. You can actually validate that everything is good, and then you hit the button, and you would have the release pipeline actually swap your deployment slots. So you're not actually doing any app setting overrides or anything like that, right? Because you're actually deploying to a second one that then switches. So that's how I would do that one. That's an easy problem. When you say infrastructure, I'm thinking VNets and subnets and that kind of stuff, and that gets a little messy. When you're trying to coordinate those types of changes. As you can tell, I've had to deal with that. It was kind of challenging. All right, so it's actually deploying the resources. By now, by the way, we should see that production resource group up there. So let me go ahead and have it refresh. So there it is. Look. So, and you can see that it's actually in process, right? It created the app insights, it created the plan, it created the service bus. The function's not there yet because the storage isn't there yet. Right, so you see, oh, the function's there, the storage is there, right? So you can actually see the resources as they're getting created by the template.
Hey, Jay,
so now we're actually in the deploy section.
We're roughly about 10 minutes over at this point. Didn't know if you had seen the clock.
I had. So. Yes, this one went a little long. I ended my other one pretty much on time. And so in just a minute, it will finish and our production deployment will be deployed. And that's it. So this, by the way, is a heck of a lot easier than standing up a bunch of VMs when you want to stand up a new environment. And then you also have the goodness of coming in here and looking at your dashboards, and you can see exactly what is in each environment. I love this view personally. All right. Any other questions? Now keep in mind, it does take a minute. So if you asked a question already and I haven't answered it or I haven't seen it, it does take a minute for it to trickle up to me. So there's about, what, a 20 or 30-second lag?
Yeah, it's about a 30-second lag, but currently there are no additional questions.
Okay. All right. So with that, thank you, everybody. You can see that all of my ARM template resources got created. This is still working. The initial deployment, not that big a deal. It will finish in time. Oh, there it is. It's done. And we're all good. And so deploying to a new environment was just that easy. Thank you for joining me for the joy that are ARM templates. If you have any questions, you can certainly shoot me an email at jsawyer@live.com. I will post, by the way, this PowerPoint, and I will go ahead and make the repo that I used public. So if you want to take a look at my ARM templates and that kind of stuff, you can. I am not, however, going to let you into my Azure subscription. Sorry. So
awesome. Well, thank you, Jay, for sharing, and thank you, everybody, for attending. The video and recording of this will actually be up on Houston Tech Fest as well, so that you can kind of rehash and walk through this as you work through your other stuff. And we will kick it over, and thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
And yes, I have seen this, the ARM template viewer, James. Yes, it's really cool. It's super useful when you have big, nasty, hairy ARM templates. So yeah, I've seen it. I use it. Love it. Love it.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.